Alright everyone, we start off today talking about the entirely new level of cope that we're seeing from the White House. Now it's with regards to inflation. At first, the other day, Biden came out and said that there was 0% inflation. And of course, this was reckoned to be a gaffe. The explanation was, well, no, that's not really what he meant. It's just that month over month the inflation rate dropped. I'm not sure, therefore, why he didn't say the inflation rate was negative 0.6 or something, because the inflation rate remains very high at 8.5. To be clear, if it hadn't been higher for a couple of months prior, it would be a 40-year high in inflation. And that's just the core inflation rate anyway. The real total inflation rate, if you were using the metric that was adopted before the 1980s, would be much, much higher. In fact, it's several points higher than it was at peak stagflationary conditions under Jimmy Carter. It would be, if I remember correctly, roughly 15%, so significantly higher than the reduced number that they've been using since then. To be clear, that means that the inflation rate has been considerably higher than it should be for basically 4 decades, almost non-stop. It hits a lull during parts of the Great Recession, another lull during the relative good times in the middle of Trump's term. Otherwise, every other part of it has been marked by inflation that technically already outpaces wages. But even if you use the core inflation number, it's reckoned to be 8.5. Now, the good news is that's lower than the 9.1 that it was at. That's good. I mean, he could just take credit for that and claim peak inflation clearly is here and is gone, and it'll keep reducing, and the Fed's actions are working. He doesn't want to come out necessarily and say that, because it could also be a temporary lull in the inflation. This has happened on 2 other different occasions. I think 4 months ago, and then at the beginning of the year, I think it was March, there was a slight drop in inflation. This drop is larger again. That's good news. There are several problems. The first is that they're doubling down on the claim that there's 0% inflation. Link in the description, archived of course. And I couldn't get archive.today to archive it, so I had to use archive.st instead, and then you tiny URL it because it remains rather large. There's an extra step involved. They're actually doubling down. This is from Kamala, and this is from 5 hours ago, so this is in the wake of people panning Biden's original comment. We're not at 0% inflation. What you mean is that the inflation rate did not rise month over month. There's an additional compounding problem, and I've been speaking about this as inflation began to tick up in the wake of Bidenomics beginning in the first place, attacks on the U.S. energy sector, lockdownerism, etc. Inflation began to rise considerably. There's another problem. When the inflation rate drops month over month, but the entire prior year was marked by higher than normal inflation, it's a compounding factor. So that 8.5% is year over year. You can't really compare it with the prior month. You have to compare it with the prior year. That's the whole reasoning behind the number itself. But that 8.5% increase is on top of the prior year's already there increase. If inflation didn't start at some point seemingly dropping as far as a year-over-year change, it would be hyperinflation that you'd be dealing with. The fact that it dropped by less than a point, therefore, is effectively meaningless because it's an increase upon an already increased number. And technically speaking, you can trace this all the way back. I mean, really, right now, we would need negative core inflation for, God, probably a half a year solid or something like that to undo the damage done. Wages have paced well behind inflation, and all the numbers that you're going to get now are going to be disingenuous. So even if, you don't have this gaslighting, mysteriously claiming 0% inflation, which was, again, deemed a gaffe, even the liberal media was, well, he just misspoke. He didn't actually mean that. He meant month over month. Now, the increase had dropped, which never made sense anyway as an explanation, because even that wouldn't be true. But they're doubling down. They're actually attempting to claim that there's 0% inflation now. I don't see much fact-checking, by the way, going on of this. Outside of, people who do independent commentary and people who fucking hate Democrats and or Biden for political reasons. Why is it that I'm not seeing any fact-checking of what is effectively an attempt at gaslighting, initially reckoned to be a gaffe economically by the Biden administration? Is CNN going to point out to its lemming-like audience, no, the inflation rate's actually 8.5%? I mean, inflation is much more complex than the average person understands. Again, You've got the gaslighting here. But the number that you're even working with, the 8.5, is wrong on several levels. It's not the total inflation number, and it doesn't admit to people that there's no admission that that number actually counts the inflation of the prior year. So let's say, for instance, last year in this month, I can't remember what the inflation rate was, but it was already higher than it should be. I think it was around 5% at that time, or 4.5 or something. You've already seen a year-over-year increase last year of the price of all goods. You've increased by 5%, 6%, whatever it is. On top of that increase, you then have 8.5 additional percents. Unless the inflation rate is zero, or negative potentially, you have that compounding. That's the problem. The problem is, like, next year's inflation numbers, if they're not effectively negative, the core inflation rate, you'd have a big problem. The fact that it's going in the right direction on paper is wonderful. It's better than it continuing to rise. That would be far more freakish. That would, again, indicate the beginning of potentially hyperinflation. But it doesn't mean that it's good. If it went down to 5%, the 5% would still be an increase year over year on top of the prior increase. I don't know, inflation would probably have to go down to at least like 1 or 2%, fairly low numbers historically, the core inflation, in order for wages to be pacing them. It's still too much. It's still at a near 40-year high, only beaten by recent inflation data. It's compounded, and now you've got the White House mysteriously attempting to go with this cockamamie gaslighting. I can't imagine, by the way, this goes over well. You know, there's a lot of fact-checking in the Twitter responses here, that's for sure. You just don't see it from MSNBC. It's not considered newsworthy. The fact that the inflation rate was down month over month is newsworthy. The fact that it's not down year over year, which really it should be pacing wages at least and preferably be effectively zero, is overlooked. The fact that the White House is claiming 0%, which literally nobody believes, is overlooked. They can't defend it, so they simply don't talk about it. So you're just not going to see an article on the situation. I think it's just cope. I think the Biden administration is looking at its polling. Your TikTok, you're getting up towards midterms. We're almost halfway through August right now. Then you've got September and October and part of November. We're in the last stretch. We're in the last 100 days before the election. They're looking at the internal polling that you know that they have for Biden's approval, for various races. I think that they're taking the pulse of the public in the wake of the Mar-a-Lago raid. It doesn't seem that it was a good idea. There was another article, I'll be talking about this later, where actually the supposedly an FBI informant involved tangentially with the raid was like, yeah, I know, this is why it happened, etc. By the way, actually, it looks like it was a disaster. We didn't expect this kind of massive visceral response thereafter. Well, you should have known better, but I think that in the wake of that and the inflation numbers not being good, and really when people go to the store, that's when they understand the nature of how the economy is working. It's when they go to the store, the gas pump or something. It's not when CNN releases the new inflation data. They're reminded every single day, effectively, of inflation rates. They're looking at all of these things. Crime, open border, the Ukraine crisis, what's happening in Taiwan. They're not really seeing any positive points to run on. And they're getting very, very nervous, so they've turned to outright lying. And this is a lie. For VP Harris to claim that we have 0% inflation, echoing her boss and what even the liberal media originally understood to be a gaffe, a verbal fumble, saying 0% inflation instead of 0% increase month over month in inflation, which isn't itself, again, technically even true. Even that would technically be inflationary based on the numbers, based on the prior year's inflationary growth in costs. It's nuts. This is a cope. It's an outright little black lie, and they know that it's a lie, but they don't have anything left. This is a sign of desperation, I think, from the Bidenomics failure, from the asterisk stewardship. That's about all. Peace out.